Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by
the Bartlett Area Chamber of Commerce and its member Renaissance Bank, committed to supporting the growth of businesses in the greater Memphis area. Community banking with local expedited decision-making. Details at renaissancebank.com. Renaissance Bank, member FDIC.
the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
The ongoing evolution of MATA, tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining us. I'm joined tonight by Ron Garrison, CEO of MATA. Thanks for being back.
Thank you.
Along with John Burgos from the board of MATA.
How are you?
Good. Thanks for being back as well. And Madeline Faber, reporter with the Memphis Daily News. So back in February, you talked or were quoted as saying, you know, MATA may be on the verge of collapse. I'm paraphrasing, but the word collapse came up. And I think you maybe backed away from maybe the dire sort of sense that had. But what is the state of MATA right now? What are the changes that are, we'll get into the details of some of the changes and the budget challenges and so on. But let's start there. Is MATA on the verge of collapse? Is that taken out of context?
I don't think it is. MATA has a number of challenges facing it, and some of them are fiscal, some of them are operational. And we've made considerable progress in the year or so that I've been there. But if we don't shore things up fiscally, we have no capital reserve, no operating reserve, and we've had to borrow money from the city for the last several years and then pay it back just to make payroll. So being on collapse is probably a real truism, and there's things that we've put in place to keep that from happening.
You've been there a year plus.
Just about a year and a half.
Just about a year and a half. And I've said to you off the show, and there's no particular secret to this, of the people, we've had a lot of people on the show, and we write a lot of people in the paper who are trying to make change. You know, people, whether it's blight, whether it's historic properties like Crosstown, politicians and so on. Few have been dealt as bad a hand as you. I mean, I even joked with you once, why did you take this job? Talk about some of the challenges you found when you came in.
One, our maintenance department, didn't have adequate staff, and it was difficult to get the buses maintained. We had issues with parts, and we have 60 buses that are past their useful life. The bus costs $450,000, and we have 60 that need replacing. So keeping a bus on the street, that's the maintenance challenge, is very, very difficult when you got a bus that's got over 200,000 miles more than it was built to even last. That's one. IT, we had data integrity issues, we had computer issues, we had a real cultural issue. We have MATA paratransit, MATA Plus, on-time performance was about 45%. Now it's over 90%. We have on-time performance for the buses. The route structure needed to change. Right. We had some issues with the trolleys. I don't know if anyone's heard of
yes,
those.
Yeah, I was wondering if that was going to come up as well.
Along with budget issues. So there were a number of challenges that I would call threats that we had to deal with immediately.
Right. And John, you have been on the board of MATA for 7 years.
7 years.
Former city council. We talked a little bit before the show of a change in culture since Ron has gotten there. What sort of change, what was the culture before Ron got there, and what is it do you see now?
I think for people to understand MATA, you have to go quite a bit further back in history, because I don't think you have to understand why we're here. I don't think it's all doom and gloom. We have issues, but I do think there's a bright future forward. But I go back to 1977 with MATA. Any sane person could look at the routes and see that they were incomprehensible. Everybody, if you lived in Bartlett and you wanted to go to Germantown, instead of taking a route south, you would go into downtown and transfer. And you would see buses on insignificant residential streets. And the routes were historic, where it would be to get the domestic help into, out toward the suburbs. And that culture never changed. And, I started talking about the grid pattern, which, of course, Memphis is laid out east-west and north-south, and not necessarily 100% grid, but with a defined route that runs along main streets, one that drives the same way you would do it if you drove a car. And this carried on, and I remember when I went on the council in 1996, I got my own maps and went to the board, of which no members are still on. And they literally laughed me out of there, which was really foolish on their part, and because I'm not a transportation engineer. When I got off the council, I called Mike Glenn at Federal Express. I said, who's your best logistics guy? And he sent me to Sean Healy. And Sean put together a team of people, and I took my maps out there, and he came up with literally the exact same proposal, and he went to MATA. And they literally treated him like, well, run along, young man, we move people and you move packages. So that was the kind of culture that you had at MATA, never wanted to change. The board was not engaged. The board thought, boards generally deal with policy, and they thought policy was showing up once a month and voting. And but that day has gone. We have a brand new board in that I went on Myron Lowry appointed me in 2007, and when I went on, we had 3 or 4 expired terms and 3 or 4. So we have subsequently, it took 6 years, but we have a new engaged board. I mean, a real engaged board. We have a new director. We have a new. It was interesting that we did commission a short-term transportation plan, which in essence confirmed what we had said all along.
Let's come back to that, but let's talk about some of the changes that you've put in place. And I'll get Madeline involved, but you've introduced, because the backdrop of what John is talking about is this a wave of changes to routes. Okay, and we I don't know that we'll go through the details of them. They're on your site. They're on we've covered the commercial appeals cover it, and so on and so forth. But talk about these changes and making change out of that backdrop that John just talked about of a culture that didn't change, that was a bit insular. You're rolling out with limited funds a whole lot of changes to the system. So talk about those.
Well, we've dealt with the data problems and the maintenance problems, and John is right. So the grid light network is the right thing to do. I've done it in several other cities, and we've implemented part of that and are getting ready to do the full-blown transit plan across the entire city. And what that'll do is it'll make it easier for everyone to get to where they need to be. It matches land use so that you can go like you'd go in your car to your destination, which then shortens travel time and increases efficiency and productivity. So we're rolling that out and plan to have all of that done in the next year or so. We have our bus stop study that the MPO, the Municipal Planning Organization, is completing for us, and that'll help us do that. So some of it we'll do in May, a little bit more in December, and we hope to finalize everything with a large communication plan to tell everybody everything this spring.
All right, Matt.
And at the last MATA board meeting, you approved 16 route changes, which is the most significant change to MATA service that's happened since you came on board, Ron. How do these 16 changes fit into the larger framework of the short-range transit plan?
So one of the key goals is to match land use, and that means match the things where people want to go. Another is you prioritize routes, like John was talking about, your mainline routes that need to stay on the main streets, but then you have to feed those. So most of these changes, although they sound like a lot, they fixed the feeder routes, the smaller routes that feed into the larger routes, and some of the places where folks had to walk a mile or 2 to get to work and using bus, now they'll be right there. There are hundreds of folks that have told us, wow, this is going to be so great because I can actually get to work on time. So this is a kind of a big first step in laying the groundwork for implementing the rest of the transit plan.
May I interject one thing about the new plan? This is what has always been so frustrating, because when we talked about changing the plan, we wanted to take the same number of buses and the same route miles, just straighten everything out and make it revenue neutral. So the plan is revenue neutral. We're just shifting everything around, and we know that one reason we're going to have a long educational process is anytime you do any change, you can have the person that just coincidentally happens to have a bus that comes right to their front door and takes it to their front door of their employer.
And we're going to put them on the front page, and we're going to use that as the example of how the new system has failed. I mean, that's what the media does for you.
And we also have another issue about how can you change routes in this plan when you don't have enough money for the buses. Well, these are two. You have an operational issue about how you're going to run and where you're going to run your buses, and also the fiscal issue. But this should be a revenue neutral plan. It should be rolled out, as I keep saying, we need to have Citizens Month, where we lock the garages up. City Hall locks their garage up for a month, and the Daily News locks their garage up, and everybody rides the bus. And I think once people learn to ride it, take their coffee on the bus, that I think a city that can ride a bus, because there's not a lot of major infrastructure, is a city that's going to be looked at as a future city.
I will tell you, I've lived here 20 years. I've never been on a MATA bus. When I lived in New York, when I lived back in Washington State as a kid, I rode the bus all the time. I rode the subways and buses up in New York. What would surprise me most if I got on a bus today?
The biggest thing that would surprise you is the buses are much, much better on being on time. We've gone from about a 45% average to between 60 and 70%. And that including in the breakdowns, which misses every time point. If you have a missed trip, the bus doesn't go at every time point. If the fare box goes out, if there's an accident. So most of the customers are actually experiencing, instead of 45, 50% on time, closer to 80%. And we're improving upon that. And we could have a whole 3 shows on that, Eric. It's very complicated how you fix that, but that's the biggest thing you'd see. The other thing is our operators. We've done, for the first time ever, customer service and conflict resolution and, just friendliness training for all of our operators. For the first
what
time.
I think of as a driver.
So,
Okay.
right. So the drivers, have tools and and they understand the importance of their job and how to better to work with customers. So you notice how much more friendly the buses are, that they're on time, and that it might actually work for you.
Right. Madeline.
Let's talk about bus rapid transit. You guys, for the past couple of years, have been working on this Midtown Area Connector Plan, which is trying to focus on one route to increase coverage in an urban, dense area. And now we've got it narrowed down to a route that goes from downtown to University of Memphis with a bus every 10 minutes. Is this something that you've tried before?
To my knowledge, MATA has talked about it before and has done studies in the past, but they've never actually tried it. They have done some light prioritization with technology on Poplar and on Elvis Presley, and that could have been something that could have helped to do BRT, and that's part of the areas they talked about it. But we did a comprehensive study. We got a grant. It might sound like a waste for $1 million. Took 2 years, and we looked at 26 alternatives and what would work best for Memphians. And what we found is several routes that would work, but the one that came up highest from all the input was the one that you talked about. And it's not going to be bus rapid transit in the traditional sense. I don't know how much people know about it, but
Assume they don't.
okay, so bus rapid transit is branded a certain way. You have articulated buses, you have platforms, you have marketing that surrounds it. It's kind of just like light rail.
Expensive.
It's very, very, it is. It's very expensive.
Yeah.
And Mr. Virgos said, hey, wait a minute, what are you talking about? But it was a process that you had to go through to get to it. So the one that we're, looks like we're recommending is a much, much less expensive version, much scaled down, no dedicated lanes, no dedicated transports, not articulated buses, but something that provides service all day from early to late, 10-minute headways, which dramatically will improve service all the way out to the university, and into downtown.
And this will run down somewhere downtown to the University of Memphis.
Correct.
Every 10 minutes along Union and Poplar, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Mostly along Union.
Okay. And the total cost on it?
Well,
The range?
we're using the alternative analysis study, and we're applying for a Tiger grant to fund this. And we just met with the congressman yesterday to talk about, Congressman Cohen, to talk about this. So the exact costs, we're about 2 months ahead of. The Tiger grant came out April 29th. Usually it comes out in June. So we haven't determined the final cost, but it'll probably be somewhere between somewhere right around $20 million, $20 to $30 million.
And the cost to the city would be, give or take?
Well, there would be matching funds and things that they're already planned and doing
But not
and other
the full
grants.
$20 million by
No,
any stretch,
no,
right?
no,
Okay,
no.
just so people go, how are we going to do that? Because you're into budget season, right? The city's into budget season. The city is got a lot of needs. There's a huge problem with the police and the crime. And how do you make your case to a city council that is got a lot of people who want money at a time when the city is very cash crunched? How do you sell this?
I think that if you, for folks that have been in other cities, and you just talked about where you lived, or if you've been anywhere in the world, and if you look at Memphis, any city in the world that is very, very successful and people want to live, they ask about the nightlife, they ask about downtown. And folks today don't want to necessarily own a car or a second car. Every great city has a great transit system. It's the one ingredient that, you know, and you asked me, why did I come here?
Right.
I love Memphis, been coming here since the 60s. Has a great transit system. If you want to improve jobs, if you want to improve the economy, if you want to improve, you know, the entire city, you've got to have a great transit system.
Right, Madeline.
And part of, again, having a great transit system, going back to this verge of collapse, is having adequate funding. What will happen in July when the new fiscal year kicks off if you don't receive the $8 million in operations and $5 million in capital improvements dollars you're requesting from City Council?
And is that an additional eight above and beyond what you've gotten in the past, or what is define that $8 million bucks? Or what?
In addition to what you have received last year?
Right.
Yeah, it's close to that. That's what we asked for, you know, and that's what we're talking to folks about. But, you know, the mayor, you know, and his staff and many of the council members I've talked to want to figure out a way to keep that from happening. So we're crunching the numbers and looking at making changes in the route, making it neutral to minimize that. And we think, we're confident, you know, that they'll be able to step up in some way.
Right.
I don't think we'll get the full $8 million, but, you know, some semblance of that in a smaller amount to keep us from having to cut the service.
Can I do a follow-up?
Yeah.
MATA has been a terrible lobbyist on its behalf in the community and before the city council. So that's why I mentioned the culture is something that's not been great, and so we've just not been very favorable to the public. And but one of the positive things that we do, and people do have to understand, is that we put 107 buses out on the street every day. We have 36 routes, and we transport 28,000
We're going to bring a map up too that just shows the whole system. People won't necessarily be able to make out every part, but you get a sense of the scale of it when you see all the routes across the whole area.
So all the doom and gloom that we've talked about, I mean, we're still an active, functioning business. We've just, from a public relations point of view and a culture point of view, we have not historically been very good at it.
How many people take the bus every day?
28,000.
Every day.
You know, you ask about the collapse question, you kind of, you know, set me up, not intentionally, but there are so many positive things going on right now. There's been so many changes that I believe that in the next couple of years, what you're going to see is a transit system that's considered one of the best this side of the Mississippi. So we'd be talking doom and gloom, but we're rebuilding, and we're preparing for the future to be a part of making Memphis, you know, great.
And Mayor Strickland talked on the campaign, and he's talked since of wanting to rebuild, to be supportive of public transit, understanding the importance of it. Has your experience, I think he's right around 100 days, he's had a lot of distractions, but has your experience been that his staff, his folks are engaged and are supportive? Now, the funding thing is one thing. I mean, they got, you know, shortfalls, but just their focus on it and their sense of it being a priority. Is that your experience?
I was so impressed with Mayor Strickland. You know, I've met with him one-on-one. Mr. Virgos has. He's been very supportive. And his chief operating officer is unbelievably supportive. And all of his staff, I go to their MIMFAX meetings to look at the data and work with the directors. I am so encouraged with how supportive they are. I can't tell you enough how supportive
You've been around
they've been.
politics a long time. I mean, some would say, well, Ron's got to he has to say that whatever he thinks.
No,
and I think you're being genuine, but you're a board member, you've been a city councilman, you can say what you think. Do you take the Strickland message? Is Strickland following up on the campaign rhetoric in terms of his commitment to public transit?
Yeah, I think for sure that he is. First of all, Madeline, you were at the meeting the other day, and Doug McGowan, as COO, came to the meeting, and I've been on the board 7 years, and I don't ever recall a chief operating officer showing up at our board meeting. Plus, Councilwoman Swearingen was there, and all of my 7 years on the board, I can maybe remember 2 or 3 instances where a council member has shown up. So I think there is an acknowledgement on the city council, and I know that Doug McGowan and the mayor are very committed. Can I say?
Sure, go ahead.
Of course, we're looking for additional sources of revenue, but I want to give you just a couple of examples of what the short-term transportation plan, and we need to change it. I hate the name short-term because it sounds like it's just a stopgap measure. This is our plan. As we know, the schools have 7 o'clock a.m. starting times, and the reason they do it, they will tell you several reasons. One is the parents like it better, which it's not about the parents, it's about the kids. The others, the coaches like it because the kids get out of school and they have extended. But the other, and the legitimate reason, is they have to run several banks of buses because they can't have one set of buses. the short-term transportation plan was designed where it ran along most routes run where a Memphis Public High School sits. And if we could transport a significant number of high school students, it could possibly eliminate a bank of it. Well, we've had preliminary discussions with the school board. I've talked to school board members, and they spend, please don't hold me to these figures, but they'll spend $20 million a year for their transportation. Well, what they could do is they could write MATA a check for $3 or $4 million, which could come close to making up our deficits, which would probably save them a couple of million, and we can issue bus passes. So these
for middle school and high school,
not
kids,
we wouldn't have the elementary,
not elementary, but okay.
You know, another example is FedEx transports an enormous groups of people to their hub, and we've talked to FedEx about maybe if they could park at the fairgrounds or Eastgate or Wolf Chase, whatever, that they could write MATA a check, and we can transport people, which could free up significant amount of space used to park cars at FedEx, and the land would be much more productive. So
there are other solutions. I mean, there are creative ideas that you think you can maybe pursue
and they're revenue
now.
and they're revenue generating.
Okay.
And going back to alternate sources of revenue and increasing or transforming the culture of MATA, you guys keep going back to this idea of choice riders, changing the perception of MATA so that more people who are not dependent on MATA transit use the buses and increase revenue, which is, you know, interesting and great. And in looking at the data that supports bus rapid transit, you're assuming that over 3,000 people will use this route, which is double who uses it currently. Where are those people coming from, and what's attracting them to use MATA?
Well, people want to, if you look at young people today, they want to move to areas where they don't have to own a car or a second car, because the cost of cars is $9,000, $10,000 a year. You know, what would that do for them? What would that do for their retirement? What would that do for the local economy? So not having to have a car, you know, they can come to the FedEx Forum, they could come down to Beale Street, you know, they could come, you know, to areas, and this would connect very well with the intersecting routes and the transit plan that John's talking about. So it would make it easier for job access, you know, 10-minute headways. It would make it easier to go to events. It would make it easier to go and come downtown, because the strength of the urban core is a major factor in the strength of the whole region. Mm-hmm. So it would make this door open up for a whole host of folks. Now the double ridership would be just the beginning. Right. Be just the beginning.
Just 3 minutes left. The trolleys. Give us an update. Where are we? What's next? When will the trolleys be back on the tracks?
We've had some setbacks with the trolleys. I did some research and found out, you know, if you look at Kansas City or St. Louis or Atlanta or Washington D.C. or Tampa, all of them, every single one of them had a start, which is what we're having, a complete new start on the trolleys, have been way over budget and have taken 2, 3, 4 times as long as what they planned for. We're actually on track. We just met with the Federal Transit Administration yesterday. They're very happy with the plan that we have in place. And we put a request for proposal out for a contractor. I don't mean to go into detail, but we're on track to get the trolleys back into service, you know, as quickly as possible. You know, that's not going to be soon.
I mean, we're talking, it's still a couple of years?
I don't think it'll be a couple of years. I think it'll be less than a year.
Okay. And how many trolleys do you need? How many cars do you need for the downtown?
So if you look at Main Street, we're going to do Main Street first.
Okay.
And ideally I would have 4 trolleys in service and you know 1 or 2 in spare.
Right.
And then we do Riverfront, and then we would do Madison Avenue.
More?
And that would be, you know, 4 or 5 more. And
but do you think all 3 of those routes will be done within a year, or you think that Main Street back on track?
Yes.
And the cost is the cars themselves. And is that the cost?
There's several factors. When you do a new start, you have to redo everything. But
so that means like the signals and the wires and the whole thing.
Yeah, you have to do a safety certification for all that, and about 12 different plans, and we have 181 documents or plans that we have to redevelop.
I mean, is there any point at which, and maybe this is also a question for you, you just look at it and say, well, we're just not going to do this?
It's an issue that we've discussed as a board on our debates, I mean, at our retreats, and we've opted for pursuing it.
How much? Go ahead.
We have you know $400 or $500 million in infrastructure that's there
Yeah.
that we don't want to waste. Number two, if we do the trolleys the way that we plan to do, they'll come more often, they'll be on time, they won't break down because they used to break down every 500 miles. Ridership will double or triple, and it'll be a huge economic tool in bringing downtown to life in a way that you've not seen.
Were the trolleys cash positive? I mean, were they? No, they were not. But
There's
if
no
you-
transit system in the United States that I know of. There might be a route or two that's cash positive.
It's all about reducing the deficit and being efficient at what
Okay,
you do.
we just have 30 seconds here. So, but within give or take a year, and how much local money will be spent to get the trolleys back up and running? I know there's some federal money and so on, but give or take, how much local money is going to be spent to get them back up?
We
Just
haven't
real
really had any real local money except for a small match for the CMAQ grant that we got.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. I know it's a bigger issue, but thank you for being here. Thank you. Thank you, Madeline. Thank you for joining us. Join us again next week.
Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the Bartlett Area Chamber of Commerce and its member Renaissance Bank, committed to supporting the growth of businesses in the greater Memphis area. Community banking with local expedited decision making. Details at renaissancebank.com. Renaissance Bank, member FDIC.